Thank you everybody for joining. So without further ado, I'll get into this jumps and plyometrics workshop. I hope you all learned something from today and have some questions for me at the end. It's going to run for about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, then we should have time for some questions. Hello and welcome to this webinar on jumps and plyometric training. So who am I? First things first, introductions. My name is Ben Simons and I'm a recently retired three-time Winter Olympian in the sport of bobsleigh. I have a multi-sport background, playing at regional level in football and rugby as a junior and at international level in track and field as a junior and senior athlete. Alongside my sporting career, I studied both undergraduate and master's level sport and exercise science. And I've been a coach and sports therapist for the last 5 years, working predominantly in both speed and power sports, from grassroots to Olympic and professional level. So, what's on the menu for today? We're going to take a look at jump and plyometric training and the differences between the two, some technical guidelines for both, typical testing and profiling procedures, some volume and frequency guidelines, the implementation of jumps and plyometrics into the training plan, and finally, some planning and periodization recommendations. So first things first, jump training versus plyometric training. These are not the same thing. The plyometric training most often seen in the United States is, in reality, jump training, not the original method proposed by Dr. Verkhoshansky. It is different from the plyometric training mainly by the amount of time taken to execute the transition from stretch to the contraction. In true plyometrics, the exercise must be executed as quickly as possible in 0.15 to 0.2 of a second. However, jump training is valuable and should be used in the training of athletes, especially in the early years and in preparation for explosive plyometrics. So that was a quote from Dr. Michael Yesis, who was the first person to translate Soviet sports science literature, and in fact traveled to work with the so-called father of plyometrics, Dr. Yuri Verkhoshansky. So it's important to make the distinction between the two here because the terms are confused and used interchangeably. And the training modalities are quite different, but certainly complementary. So how does this look in practice? We have jump training on the left, plyometric training on the right here. So jump training features ground contact times of 250 milliseconds or above, or what we call long stretch shortening cycle, whereas plyometric training features ground contact times of below 250 milliseconds or 0.15 to 0.2 of a second, as Verkhoshansky would have recommended. This is known as fast stretch shortening cycle, fast SSC. In jump training, there's a larger range of motion, so there's more relative contribution of the hip and knee versus the ankle, whereas the smaller range of motion in plyometric training means there's more relative contribution of the ankle with force transfer. Jump training is more muscular in nature, as there's more range of motion, so there's more stretch and shortening going on at the muscle, whereas plyometric training is a lot more elastic in nature, as it features less range of motion at the joint, so more isometric contraction at the muscle and stretch within the tendon. Slow SSC jumps are correlated with acceleration, change of direction, and two-footed jumping abilities, whereas plyometric fast SSC movements are correlated with top speed and single leg jumping ability. Examples of jump training are multi-jumps, such as triple broad jump, standing triple jump, and stair jumps. whereas plyometric training and pogo jumps, hurdle hops, bounds, and hopping for distance. So let's look at some examples. Here we have some single jumps, like a box jump, seated box jump here, standing long jump, onto multi jumps, 3 times standing long jump, and a standing triple jump. And next we have some plyometric examples. So we'll start with bilateral plyometrics, so 2-footed plyometrics. We have pogo hops, as you can see already, much faster ground contact time and less range of motion. Intensifying here with some hurdle hops. And then on to some unilateral 1-foot plyometrics. Lower intensity with skips. Increasing intensity with bounds. And finally hops. So let's have a look at this force velocity curve, which I've got from Science of Sport here. So as you can see on this force velocity curve, we have slow SSC plyometric drills like counter movement jumps. So strictly speaking, these aren't plyometric drills. These slow SSC drills are jumps and multi jumps. And then we have fast SSC plyometrics, like hopping, bounding, hurdle hops, as you've just seen. They occupy very different places on the force velocity curve. So this needs to be considered when programming. So let's get into jump and plyometric training technical guidelines. So we're going to have a little bit of look at mechanics and technique here of both modalities. So first things first, jump training technical guidelines. Within jump training, we see efficient joint sequencing and projection not only ensures maximum output of the exercise, but transfers directly to acceleration abilities. The technical elements of jumps are easier to learn and can support subsequent development of plyometric drills. And here's another quote from Dr. Michael Yesses. Jump training is valuable and should be used in the training of athletes, especially in the early years and in preparation for explosive plyometrics. And I believe this is another thing that he'd learned from the godfather of plyometrics, Verkhoshansky. Okay, 3 key technical points for jumps and multi-jumps. The first point I want to bring your attention to is shin roll or ankle rocker. Some of you may be familiar with this if you are into sprinting and observe acceleration mechanics. So as you see my feet contact the floor, the shin rolls over the ankle and over the toe. This shin angle sets the direction of how we will project our center of mass. So as you can see, they're pointing straight up towards the box that I'm going to land on. And this shin roll is similar to what we see in acceleration, as the foot makes contact beneath the center of mass with a more vertical shin angle, and the shin will roll horizontally over the toe, projecting the athlete forward. So the second key point I want to make is a term I've heard coined, bum before back. So during hip extension, we don't want to see the back hyperextend. As you can see here and observe, my shoulders don't move backwards at this point. They stay at the same angle as the shin, which is orientated up towards the box where I'm going to land. At this point, the hips extend, pushing the upper body straight upwards towards the box. The third key point I want to make is hip before knee. So during triple extension,
The sequences of extension we want to see is hip, knee, ankle. This extension should also be very hip dominant. So as you can see here, as I jump, my hips fully extend before my knees. And then as my knees extend, this becomes a transitional movement. So extension straight into flexion, back up onto the box. And this is what we'll see during toe off, during acceleration. So we can see all of these key points manifest in horizontal jumps and multi-jumps. Shin roll, bum before back, and hip before knee in extension. And this is how it plays out during acceleration. As you can see, the shin rolls over the toe, and as we're moving horizontally, this is a much deeper angle than we saw in the box jump. This is going to project the body down the track. Again, the back angle is set the same as the shin, orientated down the track, and we're going to see bum before back. So the back and shoulders aren't going to shoot up in the air. The hips or bum is projecting the back straight down the track. And again, during extension, we are seeing hip before knee. And then that last bit of extension of the knee becomes a transitional movement at toe off, so that we can get the switch of the other leg down and we're into our running.
So a quick recap on jump training technical guidelines. Why are we doing it? Efficient joint sequencing and projection during jump training not only ensures maximum output of the exercise, but transfers to acceleration abilities. We saw shin roll or ankle rocker and how important that was for projection. We saw the same thing for bum before back, the way that it projected our center of mass up onto the box, and hip before knee in triple extension and the importance of hip dominance in extension. So let's move on to plyometric technical guidelines. Proficient technique is essential during plyometrics because of the associated high forces and subsequent risk of injury. It's especially important to establish correct mechanics in plyometric exercises to ensure the safety of the athlete, as they will be experiencing huge forces, especially in unilateral jumps. Research has shown that in elite triple jump, the athlete can experience up to 22 times body weight upon ground contact.
Key points for plyometrics. The first point I want to draw your attention to is dorsiflexion prior to ground contact. This ensures pre-tension through the posterior chain, increasing stiffness upon ground contact, as it allows a more active strike into the ground. The second point I want to make is, on ground contact, we want the contact point to be underneath the center of mass, with the hips, shoulders, and ankles relatively stacked. There will be some deformation, especially in the knees, but we want to limit that as much as possible. This stacked joint position should also feature a neutral pelvis and spine. We can see this play out during hurdle hops, with dorsiflexion prior to ground contact, a contact point underneath the center of mass, and a relatively stacked joint position. Another key point specific to unilateral plyometrics is the need for us to create negative foot speed. So the active strike described in the bilateral plyometrics, we now need to sweep backwards so that the foot moves quicker than our current horizontal velocity. This will decrease braking forces. You will also notice a flat-footed or full-footed ground contact, just as we would see in a maximal long jump or high jump. You see, bounding is just a series of maximal 1 foot jumps. It's not exaggerated running. And when faced with large vertical forces and or braking forces, a flat foot provides a more stable base to deal with high impact, reducing overload at the lower limb. Another good practice during unilateral plyometrics is to hold your knee below the height of your hip during flight. This ensures there is some residual tension in the quad prior to ground contact, limiting deformation during the stance phase. And now we can see how these key points transfer to top speed sprinting. So as we can see here, dorsiflexion prior to ground contact, an active strike into the ground with negative foot speed, joints relatively stacked upon contact with a contact point below the centre of mass, and the knee held just below the hip during flight. We can also use extensive means to develop these key points. These are still fast SSC movements, but a much lower amplitude than intensive plyometrics, which make them perfect for beginner athletes.
Okay, a quick recap on plyometric technical guidelines. Why do we do it? So the proficient technique is essential during plyometrics because of the associated high forces, subsequent risk of injury. So how does that look? We want dorsiflexion prior to ground contact to ensure there's pretension in the posterior chain. We lead with the heel with an active strike, creating negative foot speed, and again creating pretension in the posterior chain, increasing stiffness upon contact. The contact point should be under the center of mass with the joints relatively stacked and a neutral pelvis. We should see a full foot contact during stance. During flight, we should hold the knee just below the hip to maintain some residual tension in the quadriceps to reduce the risk of knee deformation on contact. These technical points transfer to top speed running and to 1 foot jumping performance. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at jump testing and profiling. So the typical jump profiling battery that we'll see in most S&C suites would consist of the counter movement jump, the squat jump. From those two, we'd work out the elastic utilization ratio, or EUR, and last but not least, the reactive strength index. So let's have a look at the counter movement jump. Does what it says on the tin. We try to jump as high as we can. So this was originally the sergeant jump. It was described nearly 100 years ago in the American Physical Education Review. And this was your typical reach as high as you can up a wall and then mark the spot and then see how much higher you jump, see what point you touch on the wall. The counter movement jump now is a little bit different in that we're doing it on force plates and with accelerometers, and it's almost always hands on hips now, counter movement jump. So it's the most common test used to assess your power and raw jumping ability, as there is very little technical difficulty. Ability in counter movement jump is highly correlated to acceleration and deceleration ability, moderately correlated to change of direction ability, and maximum velocity ability. This makes sense considering the ground contact times, slow SSC nature of the movement, and the musculature and joint angles involved, which is similar to excel, decel, and change of direction, and not quite so specific to maximum velocity. The thing is, the different testing procedures lead to widely different normative data. So you'll see data for vertical jump, sergeant jump, counter movement jump, hands on hips vertical jump, and arms free vertical jump, which can be quite difficult to work out what you're looking at and how to test your athlete. So arm swing itself adds approximately 10% to jump height versus hands on hips. So we can take a look at some normative data here. On the left, we have counter movement jump, hands on hips normative data. And as you can see, I have converted this to inches for you guys over in the US. You can see compared to the sergeant jump or vertical jump normative data, which is similar to what they use in the NFL here with the vertec measure, there's a huge difference here. There's a huge difference. So this is something to be aware of when you're looking at normative data for vertical jump or counter movement jump. So onto the squat jump. It's the same as the counter movement jump, just minus the counter movement itself. So it requires the athlete to pause in a flexed semi-squat position for several seconds before initiating the upward concentric phase. This is so that we cut out the stretch shortening cycle. So it tests the jumping ability, or raw power ability, concentric power ability of the athlete without the contribution of the stretch shortening cycle. This is actually really difficult for athletes to do. So unless you have a force plate, which is very sensitive, it's hard to get a true squat jump measure. Everybody tries to find the stretch reflex somehow, and I've never had an athlete that's jumped onto the force plate and managed to squat jump without the force plate detecting movement the first time. So that's something to be aware of. If you're not using force plates, it's very difficult to get this measure. The reason really that we measure the squat jump is to determine the elastic utilization ratio. And this is a ratio between the counter movement jump and the squat jump. This measures how effectively the athlete utilizes the eccentric portion of the jump and therefore the stretch shortening cycle. So the ideal elastic utilization ratio, basically the counter movement jump should be 10% more than that of the squat jump. And that would indicate that the athlete is effectively using the eccentric portion and the stretch shortening cycle. So what do we do with this data? So it has been suggested that if we find a squat jump that is within 10% of the counter movement jump score, that there's a possible elastic deficiency in the athlete, and we should prioritize plyometric training, such as pogos, bounds, and hurdle hops, as you can see down this side. Conversely, if the squat jump is 10% or less of the counter movement jump, there could be a possible force deficiency. So it's recommended that we concentrate on strength and ballistic training, like power cleans and loaded jumps. So how do we decide what sort of plyometric training to do with a possible elastic deficiency? Well, that brings us nicely to the reactive strength index. So this is used to assess the athlete's ability to jump reactively, rapidly generating force through the utilization of the stretch shortening cycle. So this is where we start to see fast SSC being tested, not like the counter movement jump during the EUR, elastic utilization ratio, which is slow SSC. This should be true fast SSC. So the reactive strength index is calculated by dividing the jump height by the ground contact time. Athletes with a higher RSI tend to demonstrate greater SSC ability, allowing them to be faster, more agile, and more explosive athletes. The RSI is tested using a plyometric activity, an actual explosive plyometric activity, not a jump. So commonly it's the drop jump or the 10 to 5 repeat jump test. You can see one of each here. So here is the drop jump on some force plates, courtesy of Tanner. And we have the coaching club over here, again on some force plates, doing the 10-5 hop test. So the best 5 of those hops will be averaged out to give him his RSI. So what should we focus on based on RSI? So I've taken this chart here of RSI abilities from a 30 centimeter drop jump. And this is taken from Eamon Flanagan's Twitter, he has got probably the best stuff out there on the internet for RSI. So we're looking at the lowest RSI here of 1.5. So it shows that the athlete has a very low reactive strength ability. So they're unprepared for moderate intensity plyometrics, and they need strength development and low level plyometric activities. Up to 1.5 to 2.0, prepared for moderate intensity plyometrics, but still reactive strength is an area for improvement. 2.0 to 2.5, this is a well-established reactive strength ability, so we can introduce intensive plyometrics. 2.5 to 3.0, we've got a high level of reactive strength, and so it could be argued that we're going to get diminishing training returns in this level if we're using more plyometric activities. And then above 3.0, we've got some world-class reactive strength levels here. So there could literally be limited capacity for any further improvements. But then this brings into question also whether an athlete with a low elastic utilization ratio is more than likely going to have low RSI as well. So the recommendation to include more plyometrics in their program will be somewhat short-sighted when they just don't have the reactive ability to deal with the forces in the first place. So this is one of my problems with looking at testing and profiling, which brings us to our next point. What is the point, I hear you ask? And I do believe that we risk paralysis by analysis if we look too far into numbers, thinking away from coaching. Data can't do your job for you. I think you need to be careful basing programming decisions on lab or jump profiling data. Seeing is believing, trust and develop your coaching eye. And confirm your coaching observations with data, not the other way around. I'm sure most of you can tell me which athletes in your group are strong and which athletes are elastic. And this likely leads to your exercise program selection. You didn't need to test them on forced plays. So I'd say use the data to confirm your observations rather than taking lab data as gospel. You see, athletes will use different strategies in the gym versus the field. And you've got to look at these things. Are they deficiencies or are they individual strategies based on the athlete's personal makeup? Every athlete is different, and using normative data to determine how to design an individual's program can be short-sighted, in my opinion. On to the next part of this workshop. Implementing jumps and plyometrics into the training plan. So first things first, what and where? You will remember the technical guidelines mentioned earlier for jumps and plyometrics and how they transfer to the mechanics of acceleration and top speed. So this is the reason I really like the thematic approach to plyometric placement within the program. You see, jump and plyometric sessions are rarely a standalone session. And I like jumps and plyometrics to mirror the focus or theme of the main session to aid in motor learning and transfer. So as you can see, for example, here, with an acceleration themed or an acceleration focused session, we have standing jumps and multi-jumps, and we have the representation of a bit of intensification there from standing to multi. During acceleration, we've got a lot of horizontal force application, slightly longer ground contact time compared to top speed. And so these jumps and multi-jumps really marry up well with the acceleration day. On a top speed day, we have pogo jumps and skips, and then intensifying to hops, bounds, and hurdle hops. There's more vertical force application, a shorter ground contact time, just as we'll see in top speed sprinting. So that brings us to when. And this is a very common question. And to be quite honest, there's no right answer. but I will give you my opinion on the matter. And before I do that, let's take a look at the Bondarchuk exercise classification pyramid. And the reason I want to look at this is because of how it represents the importance of each exercise within the program. So we have the competitive event at the top, and we have specific development exercises, specific preparatory exercises, and we've got general exercises at the bottom. But where do plyos and jumps fall in this pyramid? So they occupy mostly specific development exercises, perhaps falling for some jumps to specific preparatory exercises, but it's mostly this specific developmental exercise area. And the most important element of the training session should come when the athlete is freshest and technically competent. And the less critical elements follow then in order of merit. So how does this look? So this is an example speed session. We have a standard warm-up, and then we get into our session focus, which is the most important part of the session. So it's speed, namely 6 times 60 meters. The next element, while we're still relatively fresh and ready to perform and be able to do some learning and not be fatigued, we get into our jumps and plyos. So in this example, a very simple example, I've used hurdle hops, 4 times 5 hurdle hops to be precise. And then on to strength and conditioning. So we're getting a lot more general now. We're developing power, strength, and muscular endurance. We've got the power clean squat, bench, and core. A pretty classic strength session there. There are certainly some other places to put plyometrics. For example, for the more advanced athlete, jumps and plyos can precede the main session as activation to create higher outputs and or learning opportunities. So in that case, the jumps and plyos would be placed here in front of the main session to create some potentiation or a greater learning opportunity. In my experience, it's been more difficult to program a sufficient volume of players doing it that way because you risk fatiguing the athlete and taking some intensity out of the main part of the session, the main focus. Then we have strength exercises being placed in between strength exercises as complex or contrast training. The idea of which is to use a strength exercise to augment the subsequent jump or plyo. This is a phenomenon known as post-activation potentiation. However, my experience and most of my university research was done on post-activation potentiation. Most of my experience and my research would suggest that any PAP effect, certainly in a good athlete, has already been reached through the warm-up or the subsequent session itself. So you're better off just doing extra resistance exercises than switching between different modalities. My experience also is that it's far more fatiguing than just sticking to the resistance exercises themselves. So rather than diving too deep into those alternative placements, my recommendation would be putting them after the main session focus, but before strength and conditioning work. Volume and frequency. There's not really any accepted consensus as to the right volume of plyometrics. And this is a problem considering they can be an intense and possibly destructive. So here are the National Strength and Conditioning Association guidelines for appropriate plyometric training volume. For the beginner, which is no experience, we've got 80 to 100 contacts per session. Intermediate, some experience, 100 to 120 contacts per session, and advanced 120 to 140 contacts per session. But we can take this with a pinch of salt. In track and field, I've personally experienced 300 contacts per session. And in my experience, this was certainly excessive. In fact, many of the training group that experienced this volume suffered career-ending injuries and surgeries after short-term success on the track. So for me, the risk-reward of such volumes needs to be considered. So I've leaned towards a more minimum effective dose, and this seems to be about that. But we can take some other guidelines here, which are pretty practical. So, like any other form of intense training, plyometrics, certainly intense plyometrics, should only be performed 2-3 times a week, and training should occur in a non-fatigued state. Ample rest between sets should also be used in order to avoid turning these speed and power enhancing exercises into endurance training. As a general rule, rest 5 to 10 times more than it takes for you to perform a set of plyometrics. Another good rule is to follow is to limit your sets to no more than 10 repetitions, and that was taken from the Practical Guidelines of Plyometric Intensity by William Allen. We also see some pretty conservative plyo volumes here recommended by Derek Hansen in this great illustration, building on the work of the late Charlie Francis. So we start to see some intensification here with concentric jumps, horizontal jumps, moving into depth jumps and combination jumps. And we work our way over 5 weeks to between 72 and 150 reps per session, with a gradual volume progression over sessions within the phase. Planning and periodization. So how do we periodize jumps for plyometrics? Well, I like to stick to the 2 big pillars of periodization, especially with jumps and plyos. We've got extensive to intensive means, and along the way general to specific means, and they often marry up and complement each other quite nicely. So how do we intensify jumps and plyos? Well, the clue lies in our good friend impulse. You see, higher ground reaction forces create a more intense stimulus upon the body. So how do we increase this impulse? Well, we apply more force, and we apply force faster. So let's have a look how this looks in practice. So I've created this illustration to demonstrate how we can intensify here. As you can see, across the top, we have our bilateral jumps. And early on, we start with jumping up. So this can be onto a box and up, or up steps. Moving into jumping across. And then finally, jumping down. So impact increases across this intensification scheme. At the bottom here, we have unilateral plyometrics. We start slower with extensive means like rhythmic hops and skips. And as we increase horizontal velocity and get faster, we get into more intensive means like bounding and finally single leg hopping for distance and speed. So let's look at some exercise intensification here. So similar to the last slide, we see intensity increasing throughout the training phase, starting with low intensity activities, submax pogos and hops, and concentric jumps, as you saw in the last slide. Moving on to counter movement jumps, step jumps and stair jumps, so jumping up. So impact and impulse is lower. We start moving on to bilateral multi-jumps. So increased velocity is going to make the intensity higher during this activity. Then we get on to unilateral multi-jumps. So obviously moving on to one leg is going to increase the intensity as we're moving all impact onto a single limb. As we're getting into the very high intensity activities, we finally get to drop jumps and bounds. So in drop jumps, we have that increased impact due to gravity and momentum. And in bounds, we're starting to move with much more horizontal velocity over the ground. And finally, hops for distance, which is seen as being probably the most intense plyometric. Obviously, with a single leg, you've got to move through the swing phase twice as quick as you do during a bound. And all of the things that you have to do in the air are then sped up 2 times. So that's probably the most intense of the plyometric activities, in my opinion. So how is this going to look longer term? So during long-term development, we're going to look at these foundation, development, and realization phases. So the foundation athlete, or looking all the way back to the elastic utilization ratio and the reactive strength index, people with low elastic abilities, low reactive abilities. At this point, especially with the younger athlete, developing jump technique is paramount. We want to do this with jumps and multi-jumps, as we saw from the quote from Dr. Yes's earlier. Jumps and multi-jumps are a good foundation for plyometric activity. Developing plyometric technique itself can be done through extensive means, so low intensity, but fast stretch shortening cycle pogos and hops. Which brings us on to development. At this development stage, moderate intensity, slow SSC, multi-jumps, and fast SSC, skipping and pogos, can be introduced into the program. At the same time, it's pertinent to develop reactive strength endurance through further developing the extensive pogos and hops that we introduced during foundation. And finally, we get into realization. This is when the athlete has all of the prerequisite technique and volume in their system to deal with the high demands of intense plyometrics. This is when we start to use high intensity, fast stretch shortening cycle exercises, such as hurdle hops, hops for distance, and drop jumps. When it comes to multi-jumps, we start going for maximum effort. And this really drives intent. And this is why measured multi-jumps, so standing triple jumps, standing 3 standing long jumps, for example, these are often used within athletic development programs and with elite athletes. And it's because the number, the measurement, drives intent through the roof. So I'm going to show you all how I applied these principles of periodization and planning to my final Winter Olympic prep. This was 2021 leading to the 2022 games in Beijing. So the way it works in bobsleigh, or bobsled for my transatlantic cousins, is we'll train throughout the summer to have a push testing or ranking, which is a single man push. So you push a bobsled on your own to try and determine who are the best push athletes. And that was going to take place during September. So I planned this preparation from March through to September 2021 with the help of my coaches and physios. I've been dealing with a number of overuse injuries in the past few years, so we really adhered to those principles of periodization, namely extensive to intensive methods, low impact to high impact, and general to specific methods. So as you can see with jumps and plyos, we move from extensive through to extensive, intensive, through to intensive during the specific prep phase, and then finally an intensive low volume block for the first peak, which happens to coincide with the push test that I mentioned before. So as you can see here, the volume and the intensity, we had a very slow accumulation of both volume and intensity, but then the extensive means dropped off significantly during specific prep, and the intensive means really took over. So let me show you what this looked like on a weekly basis. We have some example weeks here, one from general prep, so we'll start with that. I had 3 main speed or running days per week. And as we mentioned, with the thematic approach to placing plyos with movements that were similar, we did the stair jumps, so jumping up, low impact, on our acceleration days, which consisted of hills during this general prep. Then on our speed day, which at this point was tempo running, we used extensive low-level plyos, namely double and single leg hops. We build up 50 contacts on the stair jump days and approximately 250 very low intensity contacts on the speed day for about 350 contacts a week. Moving into specific prep, we started to intensify. We'd moved to a high-low scheme here, so we were bunching our strength workouts onto the speed days as well, for the most part. At this point, we turned from steps, so jumping up, to jumps and multi-jumps, so jumping across. So impact increased on those jumps, and volume increased very slightly as well to 55 contacts each on those acceleration days. During the speed day, we'd moved to speed endurance at this point, and the horizontal plyos, we increased the horizontal velocity, starting with skips, bounds, and then hops for 60 contacts approximately, which raised our total volume to about 170 contacts per week. Then into the peaking phase. So at this point, the horizontal plyos were moved onto the acceleration days. And then the vertical plyos were moved to the speed day. So there's no jumps and multi-jumps now included. We're on pure plyometrics, essentially. So the horizontal plyos consist of bounds, hops, and the vertical plyos, we started to introduce higher impact methods with drop jumps and hurdle hops for about 110 contacts per week, so pretty low volume here in the peaking phase. Okay, so let's go to a quick summary of the insights that I've shared with you today. So if we go all the way back to the initial slide, jumps training and plyometrics are different but complementary training modalities. So that's the main takeaway of those differences there. The key technical points of jump training ensure maximum output and transfer to acceleration mechanics, whereas the technical elements of plyometrics transfer to top speed mechanics. The technical elements of jumps are easier to learn and can support subsequent development plyometric drills. Then those technical elements of plyometric drills are there because they reduce the risk of injury to the athlete because of the high forces that we're going to observe, especially in the unilateral jumps, which is why I place so much emphasis on those in the video. I think you should let jump profiling and testing confirm your observations, not the other way around. It's not to say it's not useful. I think it's very good to confirm your observations and make sure they're just not erroneous thoughts that popped into your head. I believe we should be conservative when prescribing intensive plyometric volume. So caveat there, that is not the same as the low intensity hops and pogos that I've described, especially for development. So with the intensive plyometric volume, I believe under 100 contacts per session and under a total of 250 contacts per week should be enough for advanced athletes to develop. I think you should pair appropriate jumps and plyos with the main theme or focus of the training session. And then the main thing for me in periodization is following that very simple extensive to intensive rule. So let's go on to the last referencing slide while I answer any questions of yours. So I'm going to jump in the chat, see if we have any questions. So we've got about 7 minutes, 8 minutes left. Any questions you've got, I'll try and answer them as best we can.
Perfect. We've got a good few questions here.
Yeah, we've got a good one from Gavin straight off the bat, which is something that's caused a bit of controversy whenever I've posted about it online. So are there specific plyo drills where you are coaching more of a non-heel contact versus heel contact? By an example. So yeah, it changes very slightly. If you'll notice, when I did the vertical plyos, so the pogos and the hurdle hops, obviously the main point that I made is to say dorsiflex before ground contact. But the eagle-eyed viewers out there will see that it was a four-footed contact. So during those bilateral, very vertical contacts, you can be landing mid-foot or on the balls of the foot. But still, there should be, just like at top speed for most athletes, the heel will still hit the floor or at least just have room for like a playing card underneath it. So it's still really a full foot contact. The issue is when you come to unilateral plyos, because of the higher forces you see, it's the same as a jump takeoff, a single leg jump takeoff. So if you've seen a guy jump for a basketball hoop off a single leg, obviously there's more braking forces, so you're going to actually see more of a heel toe rock. But if you see a guy take off in triple jump or long jump, for example, it's always still a flat-footed contact. So there are certain plyos where I would accept a midfoot or ball of foot contact, but I certainly wouldn't want to cue it. I want to kind of leave that plantar flexion to the last minute. I want kind of stretch, and I want the recoil to be left and the stretch to be left in the tissue of the Achilles and then up the posterior chain until the last minute where it lets loose into the ground.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
No problem. So I've got one from Sasa Segedi here. What do you prefer more in jump testing in terms of results? Jump height, counter movement jump, or ground contact time like RSI test? Okay, so what do I give more attention to? That would depend on the sport, the athlete. Simple as that. So what we've said is counter movement jump is correlated to acceleration, deceleration abilities. That's the main component of the athlete's sport. I'll be more worried about that. RSI, if we're looking at top speed, absolutely, it's all about top speed. It's all about RSI with top speed because that is so much more reactive. It's a much closer ground contact time to what we'll see at top speed. Okay, I'm just going through. Okay, would you consider using RSI as an indicator of appropriate plyo volume in a session? Meaning, while RSI remains a required level or indeed improves during the session, would you continue with the plyo exercise? Let me just read that again. Well, yeah, I would. If an athlete had a higher RSI, I would expect them to be able to handle more plyometric volume. Okay, let me go down to the end. For youth athletes, would you suggest working on landing mechanics before moving into jumps plyos, or do them simultaneously? Simultaneously for me. So one thing that I was going to include, but I was a little bit short on time in this presentation, was basically using depth landings, not to be confused with depth jumps. And it's funny, while I was waiting to do this session, I was sat out on my balcony eating some food, and I was watching some kids playing on a bench just under where I'm staying here. And a kid had lost his football over the bench, and the bench was about chest height for him. He was about 4 or 5 years old, and he jumps off the bench with his ball, lands, and he's absolutely fine, right? Perfect mechanics, really, landed the jump. Kids have been jumping out of trees, off climbing frames for years, and that is a lot of eccentric force. So that brings a 2 times squat kind of measurement of 2 times body weight squat measurement before you do plyometrics. It just throws it out the window because kids are already experiencing higher eccentric loads than that. So landing mechanics, I think they come in with the jumps and the jump training itself. So as you'll see, we go from single jumps, and it's usually initially up onto a box going up. It's very easy to land on there. And then you start moving horizontally. That's going to give you more braking forces. They've already learned landing mechanics jumping upwards with lower braking forces. So you're obviously reducing your risk of overloading and hurting the athlete at every point there, because muscular tension impact is all lower. So I think they definitely correspond with one another, but they are different things when it comes to jump training. And as we learned earlier, jump training is a good foundation for plyometric training, certainly mechanically. So I think they go together, really. Okay. How would you utilize a 3-day training plan for your weekly setup? That's probably too broad a question, just because I don't really have any context on what the sport is, how much time they've got, and the level of the athlete, really. Obviously, you saw in my specific prep that I moved to a high-low scheme. So I did all of my main intense exercises on my high days, and I did regeneration on low days. But I was a full-time athlete, so I could spend 4 hours training. So, I could do speed, plyos, jumps all in one day. For most of the people, certainly I program for, they can't do that. So you've got to spread things out. A 3-day training plan, you've got to be very concise with the methods you're using. So that's going to really call into question the volume of jumps and plyos that you're using, especially if the sport doesn't require, if jumps and plyos aren't a sport in and of themselves for most people. So yeah, it's difficult without context really to answer that question. Okay, with regard to eccentric utilization ratio, in terms of suggested ratios, wouldn't an optimal value depend on the profile of the sport? Yeah, I would say so. I think that's why, I put a lot of credence on using your eyes and you having a knowledge of your athletes and the sports that they're doing, and you using normative data can be really short-sighted, because you can have not only different sports, you can have athletes displaying completely different abilities and in completely different strategies in the same sport. Let's take basketball, for example. How many of you guys jump with 2 feet versus 1 foot? And then do you think their eccentric utilization ratios are going to be different? Yeah, maybe so. And that's why I don't put too much credence on normative data as far as actually setting people's training programs.
That's perfect, Ben. I think if there's any additional questions, we can actually flick them on to Ben and he can answer them then after the session if we haven't got to cover everyone's, because I know we're out of time now.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. I hope you got something out of the presentation. Try to do something a little bit different, a lot of my own opinions in there, but I hope that everybody comes out of it with some ideas and things that they can implement into their own training and their training of athletes.